La Prensa is always described as the newspaper that courageously opposed Somoza. But that is not true, or it's true, let's say, only under a very curious interpretation of the facts. What happened is that in 1980, after the Sandinista Revolution, the owners of La Prensa, they were already getting a CIA subsidy, decided to turn the newspaper into an anti-government journal, meaning a U.S. government journal. At that point, the editor of the journal and 80% of the staff left and founded a new newspaper because they didn't like this new line. The new newspaper is El Nuevo Diario, and that's the old La Prensa, if a newspaper is defined by its editor and its staff. Now, of course, if a newspaper is defined by the money behind it and the printing presses, then, of course, the new La Prensa is the old La Prensa. But that's a value judgment. Depends what you think a journal is. Is it the editor and the staff, or is it the money behind it? Well, if it's the editor and the staff, then this La Prensa has nothing to do with that La Prensa. The new La Prensa supports the overthrow of the government, the violent overthrow of the government by a foreign power, and it happens to be funded by that foreign power. Now, as far as I know, that's a unique phenomenon in history. I don't know of any remotely parallel case in the history of the Western democracies. You might look for one. I should say that none of this is ever mentioned in all this fury over La Prensa. But let's say that it's, even though it apparently is a totally unique phenomenon, something that the Western democracies would never have tolerated for a moment. I mean, we had much harsher censorship of the press when we were under no threat at all in the First and Second World War, as did Britain and so on. The idea that the British, say, in 1942, would have allowed a major newspaper funded by the Nazis and calling for the overthrow of the government, I mean, it's so outlandish, we don't have to bother discussing it. But nevertheless, true libertarians, true civil libertarians, will defend La Prensa from repression, despite the fact that this is totally unique. That is, a true civil libertarian will say that Nicaragua ought to forge new standards far beyond what the United States or England or these other depraved powers would ever consider. So the question arises, is the furor over La Prensa created because American intellectuals have suddenly developed libertarian passions that they never had in the past, or is it that they're trying to serve the interests of power? Well, that's a question that can be put to the test, notice. We know exactly how to put it to the test, incidentally. We can ask the same question about, say, our enemies, and there we can think. So let's take a look at what we do. Take, say, the World Peace Council, the Communist Front organization, or the East German, Human Rights Group or something. If you read its materials, you discover that it often has very valid critique of crimes and atrocities in the United States and the U.S. client states. In fact, often things that aren't reported much here. And by and large, it tends to be true. And they're very passionate about it because of their civil libertarian sentiments, which are outraged. Well, we have a way of testing whether they mean it or not. We ask, what do they say about the Soviet Union and its client states? And as soon as we get the answer to that, we dismiss the whole business with total contempt, quite rightly, even if it happens to be true. So if we have the honesty to apply that same test to ourselves, we can proceed to do it. So let's do it. And it's straightforward. We can begin right nearby. So let's take El Salvador and Guatemala, right next door. El Salvador once had an independent press. Before the Carter administration and then the Reagan administration launched the war to defend democracy in El Salvador, as it's called, they had an independent press. There was no censorship, because we don't like censorship. The independent press was eliminated, however. There were two newspapers, two small newspapers. Neither of them was funded by a foreign power. Neither was calling for the overthrow of the government. In fact, the most they were doing was calling for mild land reform or opposing corruption or something. One of the newspapers was eliminated by the simple device of the security forces that we fund and train and run. Took the editor out of it and a photojournalist out of a San Salvador restaurant, took him outside, cut him to pieces with machetes, and left him in a ditch. That took care of one newspaper. The owner fled to Los Angeles. The second newspaper, after several assassination attempts and the murder of a newsboy and so on, was finally surrounded by army tanks who then entered and smashed up the premises and destroyed them, at which point the owner of that newspaper fled to the United States. Since then, there's been no independent press in El Salvador. But notice this was done without censorship, real civil libertarian standards. So we ask now we ask the kind of question we ask about the Communist Party. What was the reaction in the United States to this? Well, the answer to that is pretty simple. The reaction was zero. FAIR, the media monitoring organization, recently did a survey of the New York Times since the two newspapers were destroyed. Up until the time they were destroyed, there were a couple of small stories, meaning that they knew what was going on. The stories were about bombing attacks against the newspapers by the security forces and death threats and so on. Once they were the destruction was not reported, and there has been not one word referring to that in the New York Times since, in the news columns. There has been not one word referring to it in editorials. The only reference to it is in one op-ed by one of the owners who fled. That's it. That's the total cover. Well, that tells you how much we care about freedom of the press. Tells you what our libertarian standards are. Let's move over to Guatemala. In Guatemala, again, there was no censorship. The press was taken care of by the simpler device of just murdering journalists. About 50 journalists were murdered during the early 80s when we were enthusiastically, Reagan administration was enthusiastically supporting the war, the really genocidal war, and that took care of freedom of the press. Now, after the democratic opening that we proudly hail in 1986, in early 1988, one of the editors who had fled and was living in exile decided to test the new democracy, and he returned to Guatemala. This is now last summer, and spring, and he opened a small newspaper. Wasn't calling for the overthrow of the government, wasn't funded by foreign power, nothing like that. Mild liberal newspaper. As he returned to the country, he received death threats. They weren't reported. He then opened the paper, ran a couple of issues. Right at that time, incidentally, there was, again, huge furor in the United States about La Prensa. The Washington Post was denouncing the Sandinistas as totalitarian because there was a newsprint shortage, and La Prensa wasn't able to function as well as it could for a while. Right at that point, 15 armed men, obviously from the security forces, broke into the offices of this newspaper, firebombed and destroyed the offices, and kidnapped the night watchman. The next day, the editor, that was the end of that newspaper. The next day, the editor had a press conference, which, as far as I know, no American reporter went to, in which he said, obviously, there can't be freedom of press in this country. He received more death threats. He fled the country, accompanied to the airport by a Western ambassador to make sure he got there alive. What was the reaction to that? This is last summer. Well, zero. The Washington Post and the New York Times didn't even report it. Now, it's not that they didn't know about it. We know that they knew about it, because if you really read carefully, you'll discover a couple of weeks later an oblique reference to it in a column on another topic and so on. It's just that it's not important. Well, again, that tells you something about our concern for freedom of the press. Let's take the third obvious case, the leading U.S. client state, Israel. Israel is the major recipient of U.S. aid. So what's there? How do we react to violations of the freedom of press there? Well, there's many examples, so we can test it. For example, one of them was about a month ago. A month ago, on March 9th, the editor of a Nazareth journal had a press conference in the Beit Agron, it's called, what amounts to the National Press Club in Jerusalem, I guess. And he announced the fact that his newspaper had been closed by the security forces on the grounds that it had contacts with hostile elements. Nobody said it had published anything wrong, anything critical to the state. In fact, everything that it published went through censorship. But the security claimed that it had contact with foreign elements, hostile elements, and that's enough to eliminate it. So his newspaper was closed. So we can check and find how much reporting there was of that. Notice that every American journalist knew about it. The press conference was given in the place where they pick up their mail and go to pick up what's called the news and so on and so forth. You know how the media work. It's just not important. It's by no means the first time. When La Prensa was closed, La Prensa was suspended right after this declaration of war by the United States. The same month, history was kind enough to set up a controlled experiment for us in this case. The same month, Israel closed 2 Jerusalem newspapers on the grounds that they had contact with hostile elements. That one actually went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court announced that while we have freedom of speech in Israel, it cannot be used to do anything possibly harmful to the state. And it said no government will allow a business, however legitimate, to function in its borders if it's supported by hostile elements. Well, that's La Prensa. How much reporting was there over that? They were closed permanently, incidentally, not suspended. Reporting on that was not quite zero. There was a reference to it in a letter of mine to the Boston Globe, commenting on the total hypocrisy of the Neiman fellows. But as far as I'm aware, that was the sole reference to it. So you can call that statistical error if you like. That's when La Prensa was opened. La Prensa was opened in October 1987, and again, history was kind enough to do a controlled experiment for us. And that month, another newspaper was closed in Israel, this time in Nazareth. No report.